that René was developing his first major discovery of mimetic desire, which was in the late 1950s. Really one of the most popular ways of thinking about human desire at the time was the pervasive influence of Freud's autonomous theory of autonomous drives, or his dual instinct theory, where you have a life instinct and a death instinct, and they're very autonomous. And the analytic way, the Freudian way of thinking about human desire was very pervasive, very powerful interpretive lens that was used for looking at literature, all sorts of areas of human cultural life. So another important reason why these dates are important is that by 1978, after René had written his 3 major texts and developed more or less the foundations of his entire theory, imitation was actually not a very popular topic in the sciences. And he observes that in the science of man and culture today, there is He says that in the science of man and culture today, there's a... Oh, wow.
Yeah. Just pause. Yeah.
How do I...
You pause it. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, so this is at the beginning of Things Hidden Since the Foundation World in 1978. Girard says that in the science of man and culture today, there's a unilateral swerve away from anything that could be called mimicry, imitation, or mimesis. To develop a science of man, it is necessary to compare human imitation with animal mimicry and to specify the properly human modalities of mimetic behavior if they indeed exist. Well, in fact, this is what has happened over the last 30 years from a wide range of disciplines listed here that I'll go through briefly. In the last 30 years, this is, more or less is exactly what has happened in terms of rediscovering human imitation. So the first discipline is developmental psychology. One of the predominant cognitive theorists of the 20th century in cognitive developmental psychology is Piaget. Piaget thought that infants had to learn to imitate and did not really develop the capacity to imitate until after a year in life. And this was after already a year of rich experience of sensory motor activity in the world and the development of certain representational capacities that allowed them to eventually match their own behaviors with the seen behaviors of others. So this was a developmental milestone for Piaget. Well, one of the major breakthroughs in empirical research was the finding that, as William mentioned, is that infants just minutes old can imitate adult facial gestures, basic adult facial gestures and hand movements, and the youngest being 42 minutes old. And Trevarthen, who's another developmental psychologist, also observed that very early in infancy, not only do infants simply imitate facial expressions and gestures, but they actually participate in these sort of proto-conversations, these contingent back and forth, turn-taking, attunement interactions with mothers. And so this really opened up a whole new way of understanding the fundamental building blocks of the origins of human life from a developmental ontological perspective, which really in the last 30 years has rewritten a lot of the theories of the way we understand what we come into the world with and how we develop out of that. And Trevarthen says more recently that we use imitations interactively to motivate one another reciprocally from the start. And these earliest imitations offer the greatest challenge to psychological theory. So there's obviously some resonance here with the René's fundamental assumption of mimetic desire. So apart from immediate imitation that Andrew Meltzoff observed, He also found that not only could infants imitate something immediately in front of them, such as these adult faces, but very early on, much earlier than Piaget thought as well, infants can defer imitation. So that is, they can see some novel behavior that they've never seen before, never performed themselves, and then imitate that after long periods of delay. So in this experiment, initially the infant is sat across from an adult experimenter who has a panel in front of them. The adult experimenter bends his head down, presses the head on the panel, and then the panel lights up. The infant is on the other end watching the adult experimenter do this novel behavior that they've never seen any other human do before. They simply observe it. They're removed from the situation. In this case, this is a 1-year-old infant. Comes back 4 weeks later, sat across from the same adult experimenter, and in slide 1, the infant looks at the adult, looks down at the panel, and then proceeds to press his head on the panel, comes back up, and in the last slide, right, looks at the adult experimenter and says, hey, look at me, I did this thing, right? I remember you 4 weeks ago, you did this thing, I'm doing it now, and we have this connection. So whereas Piaget thought that infants, especially in the first year of life, had no real connection to past events at this level, we now know that infants can see novel behaviors of others and carry this in some representational way, imitate it from memory without any practice, very novel behavior, and it's very relational. So to jump to comparative psychology, which is really to try and understand what's the significance of imitation, and it's how it helps us understand the passage from non-human primates to humans. Developmental psychologists have become also very interested in primate imitation and primatology to look at how, in fact, do other non-human primates imitate. And as Hurlbut talked about a bit today, William, other primates do imitate, although there's been some debate on this. Chimpanzees do imitate, but it can be very hard to get them to imitate. So they will actually, through a lot of exposure to human intervention, eventually imitate in some forms, but they don't carry this back to their own conspecifics, and they don't really spontaneously imitate on their own in ways that humans do, and certainly aren't able to imitate very novel behaviors in the way that very early children do. So there's certainly a gap in the power of imitative ability in non-human primates and humans. And along with that, what comparative psychologists have found is that as socially intelligent as chimpanzees are, they actually lack very basic skills of social intelligence that we humans take for granted. So for example, other chimpanzees don't actually point in reference to something to get another chimpanzee to look at it. They also don't hold out an object to either show something to somebody, another chimpanzee, or to offer it to them. And they don't take another chimpanzee over to some location to show them something that happened or something that they want them to see. And then finally, they don't participate in active teaching of skills. So all these different behaviors go into what ultimately amounts to our capacity for imitation in many different ways. And a way of understanding this is that how we get from the very highly evolved social intelligence of chimpanzees to the social referencing that happens to other objects and the desire to share things with other conspecifics is that somehow humans at some point began to resonate and identify much more deeply with one another than what chimpanzees do and other monkeys. So again, William talked about this a little bit, the sort of joint attentional gazing at one another, as you see these two infants doing, the staring back and forth into one another's eyes. Other monkeys don't really do this. So there's a deeper identification